Well, we spent some time thinking about what barriers to entry there are for new firms that might want to come into a market. What we need to think about now are strategies that firms that are in the market might use to try to discourage new entrants. So just to summarize the basic ideas, we saw in the model of monopolistic competition that the existence of economic profits acted as an incentive for new sources of supply to come into the market, for new firms to come in and establish themselves. We saw the reverse as well, that if economic losses existed for your typical firm in a market, that was an incentive for firms to leave the market. Well, if we think about economic profits and the threat of new entrants, we should remind ourselves that that new competition could be domestic or foreign. As I'll explain in a few minutes, different strategies might be adopted against foreign firms than would be available against domestic firms. Well, we want to ask, can existing firms do anything? And if so, what? We saw in the model of monopolistic competition that sort of by definition of monopolistic competition, firms were unable to do anything. That was really a result of two situations, two characteristics of that market. One is that each firm was really quite small. So you could imagine that it wouldn't really pay each individual firm, if firms are very small, to act in some way that's going to discourage new entrants. They're just too small to matter. Firms would have to cooperate in some way in order to act effectively. But in that model, they can't anyway, because by definition, the barriers to entry are quite low in such a market. Well, what can firms do to increase the size of entry barriers or to discourage new entrants? We'll look at some ideas, but I think the answer boils down to there's not really too much that firms can do, at least if they're going to stay within the law. They might be able to take actions to delay the entrance of new firms or to raise costs slightly so that entry is not quite as attractive. One theme that keeps cropping up again and again is the idea of the importance of product differentiation. That is, just making your product, your good, your service somehow significantly different from what others are offering. So that's where ideas like having a valued brand name, the trust of customers, having offered good customer service in the past and built up a good reputation, those things are important because the stronger those things are, the more reluctant your customers are going to be to leave for some other supplier. So, to put it in the jargon that we use, or to use the economic idea, the stronger is your position in this respect, the less price elastic is going to be your demand. So you want your demand to be as inelastic as possible. Now we've seen that the profit maximizing firm is always going to be producing where the price elasticity is greater than or equal to 1 in absolute terms. But you'd like your demand to be less elastic, all else equal. We could also just remind ourselves of the cross-price elasticity of demand, which is saying just how substitutable is your product for those of other sellers. So again, the more differentiated your product, the lower that cross-price elasticity. So if new firms come in, they're going to do you less damage than would otherwise be the case. It also means that entry is going to be less attractive for new entrants because they're going to face the potential of smaller profits. They're going to have to perhaps spend more in order to overcome this barrier, to establish their own reputation and brand name and so on. So that might involve, for example, suffering losses for some time until they build up a reputation. Well, that's one rather obvious strategy that the firm could adopt. In some circumstances, it's also possible for a firm to control access to a key input. So by this, we just mean that there may be some things, maybe a physical object, it may be knowledge, that's necessary to produce the kind of product that you're making. And if you can keep that input away from potential entrants, then they won't be able to enter the market and compete with you. Here are a couple of examples that occur to me. The one on the left, some people might recognize. Just to give you a hint, it's a very special worm that produces a very special substance. And if you're from China, you should recognize that worm. It's a silkworm and was the key ingredient in being able to produce silk. So long ago in China, silkworms could not be exported. The silkworms and the silkworm eggs were protected, and taking them out of the country was risking being executed. Of course, some of them did escape long ago, and silk ended up being produced in Japan and in the Eastern Roman Empire a long time ago. On the right-hand side, we see some examples of handmade glass that if any of you have been to Venice in Italy, you may well have gone to the little island of Murano, which is quite near Venice, where these things were produced. It's very special skill is required to make glass in this way, and people who had that skill back in medieval times were not allowed to leave the island because they would take that skill with them, and then the secret of Murano glass would be lost. So glass has been produced there since the 1200s, and if you go to Venice today, you can go and visit that island and see glass still being made. Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is the idea of import restrictions. So there are certain rules that allow foreign competition to be kept out of the domestic market, at least temporarily. So the idea is this. Governments can be asked by a business to restrict imports of competitive products under certain circumstances. The rules are governed by what's called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This is an international treaty, an international agreement that the World Trade Organization, or WTO, administers. And under the rules of this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, there are certain circumstances in which a foreign firm's products can be restricted. And that restriction takes the form of what is called a tariff, which is just really a special word for an import tax. So when can tariffs be applied? Well, if you look at the example of the United States these days, tariffs are just applied whenever the president feels like it. Those actions are in violation of international law. So I'm not going to give you any hopes that you would be able to persuade anybody to behave in that way to keep out foreign competition. But there are some legal ways of doing it. One of those cases is where the foreign imports are being subsidized by a foreign government. So if imported goods are unusually cheap because they're being subsidized, they're being given some financial assistance by the foreign government, and if that competition is injuring domestic firms, and by the way, I just used the word domestic to mean firms within our own country, then the government could impose an import tax or a tariff to offset that subsidy. So if the subsidy, for example, is worth 20% of the value of the imported goods, a 20% tariff could be applied to exactly offset that. You can also have a tariff if the good that's being imported is being sold here in the domestic market below cost, or if it's being sold at a price that's less than what it's being sold at or sold for in other markets. So, for example, if something was being sold for much less in Canada than it was being sold for in Europe, then one could claim that that good is being dumped or it's being sold at an especially low price and is damaging domestic producers. So in that case, an anti-dumping tariff could be applied. Canada's doing that, I believe, at the moment with a number of products coming from China, different kinds of steel products. So the Canadian steel industry is being protected from Chinese competition, at least for certain kinds of steel, on this basis. Finally, there's a rule in international trade where if foreign goods are flooding into a market very cheaply and in large quantities and are causing what's called serious injury to domestic producers can get together and ask the government for protection. That protection can only be temporary, but at least it's some restriction on foreign competition.